It is that beauty, which really is the eternal beauty that is truth. This is God. Not the proof, but the thing. Not his work, but him. Wonderment is our morphine, I suppose. All us Americans dream of places. They are our God. Our dreams. Us, perhaps.
I suppose.
Evelyn Miller. He is a professional writer within the story of Red Dead Redemption 2. He's seemingly a very insignificant figure, as we only see him in a few times within the actual game. With his greatest on-screen contribution that most people will ever see him doing is during our time in the city of Saint Denis. Evelyn Miller is in the middle of helping the Wapiti natives bureaucratically fight for their land back. Outside of this, there's a 5-part Stranger mission exclusive to John Marston where we can find Evelyn Miller in the middle of writing another book. The series of missions with Miller are ones riddled with Easter eggs regarding the first game, such as John's comments on being shocked by Bigfoot.
Unless you're showing me Bigfoot, you should know. I'm not so easily shocked, Mr. Miller.
A reference to the Undead Nightmare DLC, or when Evelyn Miller locks himself in his cabin, refusing to allow himself to be freed until the next draft of his book is completed. Upon locking himself within the cabin, forcing himself to reach his greatest depths of creativity, Miller utters a eerily similar apology John would hear a few years later from an old friend.
I can't fight my own nature. None of us can.
All I ever did was fight.
Then give up, Dutch.
But I can't give up, neither. I can't fight my own nature. That's a paradox, John.
It's this right here that shows us Evelyn Miller's greatest contribution to this series, the unseen inspiration behind the virtues and complicated mentality of the infamous outlaw Dutch van Der Linde. Dutch can be seen reading and quoting Evelyn Miller's book throughout chapters 2 and 3, these books that inspire his opposition against the modernization of the West and the eloquent choice of words that he implements to best express these views are quoted within these 2 books that can be found. Now today I wanted to dive a little deeper into both of these books as I feel they not only give us a little bit more insight to, of course, Dutch's mentality, but there's also parallels from the contents of these books to what happens in the main story of Red Dead Redemption 2. The first of these 2 books is titled Existence and Oblivion by Nikolai Fedorov. Unfortunately, both of these books provide a very limited read, but the time that the passages open up to, I feel these books are very important. Inside Existence and Oblivion, for example, the passage is only 2 pages long, but it's filled with dialogue between 2 brothers in Russia. Sergei is a priest who is sick and dying. The contents describe him at one point wheezing and having sickly yellow eyes. These are symptoms both known to be tied to tuberculosis, the very same sickness Arthur would later come down with. In this passage, Andrei, Sergei's brother, shares he's envious of his brother. He may be sick and dying, but he always had a sense of faith and conviction that still doesn't leave him in this face of death. Andrei shares that he left the church behind long ago, but only found more nonsense out in the world, expressing that he's becoming overwhelmed with the feelings of loneliness and being trapped. Sergei tells him he can be saved. There's still time for him. Sergei's dying, but Andrei has a chance to live. The way the passage ends is Andrei being told by Sergei to kill him so he could be a man once more. So there's obviously a little bit of context missing and why he must kill him, but ending aside, at first, the feeling of being trapped and there still being time for Andrei's salvation at the demise of Sergei, at first I thought this was a parallel between Arthur and Dutch. The church served as a metaphor for Dutch's belief, and in the face of the gang falling apart, even he abandoned it, finding quote-unquote only more nonsense as he delved deeper into disillusioned vision of the world he inhabited. After a second read and less stretching though, I think the parallel is actually between Arthur and John. It makes a little more sense as they are brothers after all. Arthur would be taking the role of Sergei and John, Andrei. While Arthur doesn't meet his end at the hands of his brother, John does technically get a second chance of salvation due to Arthur sacrificing himself, giving John that redemption, a way of being saved, a way out of feeling trapped and locked in his criminal lifestyle, similar to how Andrei felt trapped in the life that he was living without any sense of faith or direction. By all accounts, the events on top of the mountain in Beaver Hollow did give John a fair chance to actually redeem himself. It was John's own actions that got him where he ended up much later on. John throughout the game is very indecisive, mimicking Andrei's lack of faith and direction, while conviction and faith is something that is almost unmoving in Arthur until the later stages of the game, being very similar to Sergei. Only Sergei's Ray's sense of conviction would never wane, while I feel Arthur's sense would be more towards the people that he really loved and still felt loyal to, which at the end of the game would ultimately be John. It's not a direct one-to-one by any means, but there is a bit of foreshadowing drawn up here within this book. I'd also like to point out whoever wrote this is extremely talented. It's a satisfying read on its own, and it's very believable that this is its own dedicated book. But I wonder if this was rough draft material for the story at one point, but instead of completely scrapping it, they decided to just reuse it as a way to foreshadow events while feeding into Dutch's view of the modernizing world. We get an actual source of Dutch's idealism beyond just his stories and his past of being an outlaw. Dutch's taste in literature and the eloquence in wording and poeticism tied behind it gives so much more insight. If we go back to the passage though, Andre does mention traveling abroad all across Europe, and even in the heart of St. Petersburg, he still feels lost. That true salvation can only be found within the forests and the trees, a sentiment that's not only echoed by Dutch, but Evelyn Miller inside his book, American Eden. There are contents here within Evelyn Miller's book that Dutch has almost even repeated verbatim, the most obvious of which being the line he says to Agent Andrew Milton when he shows up inside the gang's camp at Clemens Point.
Ain't no such thing as civilized.
It's man. So in love with greed, he has forgotten himself and found only appetites.
Within the book of American Eden, Evelyn Miller shares his thoughts on how America is a land captivated by its own appetites. People are taught to cherish the fleeting feelings of satiety, but chasing after such a feeling is not true liberty. People are free to think, to be, and to feel, but they aren't free to choose their own poison. This land has deceived itself into thinking it can compete with God, to be satisfied with an environment of its own design, but no one is happy in this world of modernization. No one is happy within the confines of a factory. No family unit is healthy when wives and children are treated like they're awful burdens instead of seen as cherished family members. To be free, to properly free the American spirit, the new world and the world they have placed themselves in must be destroyed. They must return to the American landscape. Freedom, in the true sense of liberty, is found within the open wilderness, far from the grasp of society and being told what you do and don't like. An idealist and a dreamer no different than Dutch, it's quite obvious how Evelyn Miller inspired Dutch, or gave him the concepts to be able to grasp at ideals and concepts that may resonate with others who may not find themselves particularly welcomed within this new world, a world that seems completely foreign to them all. It's a small thing, but to see and hear Dutch almost completely quote Miller, and Dutch being presented as a poet, a romanticized outlaw, and by contrast, Miller's a poetic idealist, a dreamer who is so devoted to his craft. He refers to it as his nature, a nature he cannot fight, no different than the nature that was inside of Dutch, fighting against another person's will. Being able to connect with the ideas and position found within the contents of American Eden, a book that appears to take an oppositional stance against the current state of the world. It would not only make Dutch appear to be more of an alluring figure, especially to people who feel as if they're outsiders to society as it is, not necessarily people that are outlaws, just more within the realm of being dreamers, people who are stuck within the confines of their books, not really exploring the world, just captivated by the things they read, allowing their imaginations to rule how they see the world. People who would be naive to the criminal lifestyle on top of being these dreamers would undoubtedly see outlaws such as Dutch and the Van Der Linde gang no different than how they would view gangs that were more bloodthirsty and savage, such as the O'Driscolls, the Del Lobos, the Laramie gang, or even the Skinner brothers. These people are already perceived as savages, robbed of any kind of morals or ethics, but if Dutch could appear to be charismatic, well-kept, promoting the notion of his gang being a family and not robbing and killing indiscriminately like the others, but more so taking from the ones that can afford to take a loss, then it just adds to the more complex character of Dutch. The benevolent stance of taking people in, regardless of the background, while attempting to fight inequality of society, and then being able to properly echo a sentiment these people are already reading within books, would at the very least paint Dutch as a much more enticing alternative to just giving into the way of the new world. I think being able to echo the sentiments of a book by itself would be quite a shock, especially in the 1800s where a good number of people were illiterate. And then to run into a man such as Dutch who doesn't seem to be dirty, illiterate, bloodthirsty, or eager to rob anyone as soon as the opportunity would arise would be a strong challenge against most people's understanding of criminals and how they're supposedly below everybody else. If Red Dead Redemption 3, if it ever does happen, does decide to continue to explore Dutch van der Linde and the origins of the van der Linde gang, I would love to see that side of Dutch. We see a little bit at the very beginning of the game during the chapter of Coulter where he's trying to get everyone to rally behind him, but you don't really see that again, at least not to that level where he's trying to preach to everyone's softer side, a more delicate side. Red Dead Redemption 2 story is all about his mental decline and of course the disintegration of the van der Linde gang as a whole. So I think exploring the origins and seeing that side of Dutch at its true peak would be interesting. Just think of all the talents he would come across that do or don't know exactly who he is, and he's able to sway them in a completely different direction just based off of how he's able to talk and communicate. Rockstar does a fantastic job at storytelling like this, and watching Dutch do that through conversations I think would also indirectly give us a good idea of the mentality of people during that time period, or at least the mentality that Rockstar is trying to get us to understand is pretty dominant within the world of that game. The book, An American Eden, doesn't say when exactly it's published, but it does speak of the modernization of the world going on. And of course, within Red Dead Redemption 2 and Red Dead Redemption, the states of New Austin and the world that those games take place in are pretty opposed to government regulations, modernization, civilization. So that book is already parallel to something that's already going on. It would be interesting on the flip side to watch Dutch in, say, Red Dead Redemption 3 to preach these ideas before they even start coming in this area or this direction, which would then give Dutch this title of being some type of messiah or someone that's ahead of the curve and aware that's what around the corner. They may not be exactly true, but it's enough of a stretch for him to persuade people and get them to understand and go along with whatever it is that he's trying to go along with. That in turn would also add a little more depth to his overall manipulation, which he's very good at as well. Either way, still gotta give Rockstar credit for the small little bits of information that they riddle throughout the game that you can pick up as early as Chapter 2. That provides insight to not only the mentality of Dutch van der Linde, but foreshadows a little bit of the main story events of Red Dead Redemption 2.